In the year 30 BC, Roman soldiers entered Alexandria without resistance. The greatest city of the eastern Mediterranean did not burn. Its harbors were intact, its temples were standing, its streets were full of people. There was no siege, no final battle, no heroic last stand. The dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries simply ended. The last queen of Egypt was dead. Her son had been executed on Roman orders, and the richest kingdom of the ancient world became the personal property of one man in Rome. To Roman writers, this moment was described as a victory. Later generations turned it into a romantic tragedy, a story of passion, betrayal, and suicide. But the fall of Cleopatra was not a love story. It was the final collapse of a political system that had been built long before she was born. A system created after the death of Alexander the Great. A system where Greek kings ruled over Egyptian land, where royal families spoke one language, governed another culture, and depended on Rome for survival. Cleopatra did not lose her throne because she trusted the wrong men. She lost because the world around her had changed faster than any dynasty could adapt. Rome no longer needed sacred kings. It needed administrators, generals, tax collectors. Egypt had survived invasions, revolutions, and civil wars, but it had never faced a power that replaced kingdoms with provinces. When Roman banners appeared on the walls of Alexandria, Egypt was not conquered. It was absorbed. Its rulers disappeared. Its institutions remained. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the Nile belonged not to a king, but to an empire. To understand how this happened, we have to return to a time when Egypt still believed it could control its own future.
To the birth of a queen who inherited not an empire, but a slow and invisible collapse. Cleopatra was not born into an Egyptian dynasty. She was born into a Greek one. 3 centuries before her birth, Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. When he died, his empire collapsed into rival kingdoms ruled by his generals. Egypt fell to one of them, a Macedonian officer named Ptolemy. He founded a new royal house that would rule the Nile for almost 300 years. The Ptolemies called themselves kings of Egypt, but they never became Egyptian in the way earlier pharaohs had been. They spoke Greek. They married within their own family to preserve bloodlines. They governed through a court modeled on Hellenistic monarchies, not ancient temples. Their capital was not Memphis or Thebes, it was Alexandria, a city built as a Mediterranean port, filled with merchants, philosophers, and immigrants from across the Greek world. To the Greek elite, Egypt was a source of enormous wealth. To most Egyptians, the kings were foreigners who collected taxes and lived behind palace walls. The old religious system continued to function. Priests crowned rulers as divine, temples performed rituals, the Nile flooded as it always had. But real political power had shifted away from sacred tradition and into bureaucratic administration. Greek officials controlled land, grain, and finances. The dynasty survived not because it was loved, but because it was efficient. Cleopatra grew up inside this divided world. At court, she was educated as a Greek princess. She studied philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, and astronomy. She learned how to speak in public, how to negotiate, how to argue.
But unlike most of her ancestors, she also learned Egyptian, not as a ceremonial language, but as a political tool. She understood that her family ruled a land it did not truly belong to, and she understood that the greatest threat to that fragile balance no longer came from internal revolts. It came from Rome. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII. In official inscriptions, he was called the New Dionysus. In reality, he was remembered as a weak and unpopular ruler. He spent more time on music and festivals than on governing. He relied heavily on Greek advisors who controlled the army and treasury. And above all, he depended on Rome. By the early 1st century BC, Egypt was no longer independent in practice. Roman politicians treated it as a financial reserve. Egyptian grain fed Italian cities. Egyptian gold funded Roman campaigns. When Ptolemy faced revolts in Alexandria, he did not suppress them. He fled, not to another city, to Rome itself. There, he borrowed enormous sums from Roman bankers and generals. He promised political loyalty in exchange for military protection. Egypt's future was mortgaged to secure his own return. Roman legions escorted him back to the Nile. He regained his throne not as a sovereign king, but as a client ruler. His first act after restoration was not reconciliation, it was execution. His eldest daughter, who had ruled in his absence, was put to death. The message was clear. Power no longer came from tradition or legitimacy. It came from Roman approval. Cleopatra was a child when this happened, but she learned the lesson early. The throne she would one day inherit did not stand on Egyptian foundations. It stood on Roman soldiers, and that meant any ruler who lost Rome would lose everything.
Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC. Cleopatra was 18 years old. According to the dynasty's rules, she could not rule alone. The throne was shared with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of 10. Officially, they were equal monarchs. In practice, neither of them controlled the state. Real power belonged to the royal court, to advisors who managed the army, the treasury, and palace security. These men had survived multiple reigns. They had removed rivals before, and they were not interested in a strong queen. Cleopatra understood the situation immediately. She attempted to rule actively. She issued decrees in her own name. She appeared in public ceremonies without her brother. She presented herself not as a symbolic figure, but as a decision maker. This alarmed the court. Within months, her name disappeared from official documents. Coins were minted with only her brother's image. Cleopatra was quietly removed from power. The guards who had once protected her now watched her movements. She did not wait for arrest. She fled Alexandria under cover of night, eastward, across the desert, into Syria. There she began to build a private army, not through royal command, but through money, alliances, and negotiation. At 18, Cleopatra was no longer a ceremonial queen. She had become a political exile, preparing to fight for her throne, and the fate of Egypt would soon depend not on dynastic tradition, but on the outcome of a Roman civil war. While Cleopatra was gathering support in Syria, a much larger conflict was unfolding far beyond Egypt. The Roman Republic was collapsing into civil war. Two men stood at its center, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great.
Once allies, now enemies, they commanded the largest armies the Roman world had ever seen. Caesar marched from west to east, defeating Pompey's forces across Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor. Pompey fled, not to a fortress, not to loyal provinces, but to Egypt. He believed the Ptolemaic court would offer him protection. He was wrong. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII saw an opportunity. They assumed Caesar would reward them for eliminating his rival. They believed loyalty could be demonstrated with blood. When Pompey landed on the Egyptian coast, he was invited into a small boat and murdered. His head was cut off, his body thrown into the sea. Soon after, Caesar arrived in Alexandria. The court presented him with Pompey's severed head as a gift. They expected gratitude. Instead, Caesar was disgusted. Pompey had been his enemy, but he had also been a Roman. His execution without trial violated everything Rome claimed to represent. Caesar ordered Pompey's head to be buried with honors. And then he did something even more dangerous. He decided to remain in Alexandria, not as a guest, as a judge. He summoned both sides of the Egyptian conflict to present their claims. For the first time in its history, Egypt's internal politics were placed directly under Roman authority. Cleopatra was still in exile, but the future of her throne was now being decided inside Caesar's palace. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria knowing that the city was no longer safe for her. The palace was controlled by her brother's supporters. The guards were loyal to the court, not to the throne. If she appeared publicly, she would be arrested or killed before she could speak. But Cleopatra did not intend to arrive publicly.
With the help of a small group of loyal servants, she planned something reckless. She had herself hidden inside a large linen sack used for transporting bedding and goods. No crown, no escort, no royal insignia. Just a bundle carried through the gates of her own capital. The guards did not suspect anything. They allowed the sack to pass into the palace and from there into the private quarters of Julius Caesar. When it was opened, Cleopatra emerged not as a defeated exile, but as a ruler who had risked everything to reach the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. The scene was later romanticized by poets and painters, but in reality, it was not a gesture of seduction. It was a calculated political act. Cleopatra understood that Caesar was not in Egypt to rescue her. He was there to stabilize Roman interests, to secure grain supplies, to control strategic ports, to prevent chaos in a valuable province. She did not appeal to emotion. She appealed to logic. She presented herself as the only ruler capable of governing Egypt without constant revolts, the only one who could guarantee stability without Roman occupation. Caesar listened, not because she was charming, but because her argument was correct. Cleopatra was offering Rome something rare in the ancient world, a client kingdom that could govern itself. And in that moment, hidden inside a sack in her own palace, Cleopatra re-entered history not as a fugitive, but as a serious political actor on the Roman stage. Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra triggered immediate resistance. The court of Ptolemy XIII realized that negotiations had failed. They could no longer control events through intrigue. They turned to force. Alexandria rose against the palace. Supplies were cut.
Access to fresh water was blocked. The underground cisterns that fed the city were flooded with seawater. Caesar found himself trapped inside a hostile capital with only a small military force. He had arrived expecting to arbitrate a dispute. Instead, he faced a siege. Roman soldiers fortified the palace district. Wells were dug in desperation to find drinkable water. Food became scarce. Fighting spread to the harbor. Egyptian ships attacked Roman vessels anchored in the port. Caesar ordered parts of the fleet burned to prevent capture. Flames spread across the docks. Smoke covered the city. Warehouses and libraries caught fire. Some of the greatest collections of ancient texts were destroyed, not in a single catastrophe, but in a series of chaotic battles. Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Greek world, was burning because of a Roman civil war.
Reinforcements eventually arrived from Syria in Asia Minor. Roman troops broke through the siege. Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee across the Nile. His boat capsized. He drowned in the river his dynasty had ruled for centuries. The resistance collapsed. Cleopatra was restored to the throne. But Egypt had paid a terrible price. Its capital had been turned into a battlefield. Its independence had been preserved only through Roman intervention. And from that moment on, Egypt's survival depended entirely on Roman protection. After the siege ended, Cleopatra did not simply return to power. She returned with a new political reality. Soon after her restoration, she gave birth to a son. His official dynastic name was Ptolemy XV, but history would remember him by another name, Caesarion, the Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this child was not just an heir, he was a political statement.
The living proof that Egypt was no longer merely a client kingdom of Rome. It was now directly linked to the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra made sure this connection was visible. She did not hide the child. She displayed him in public ceremonies. She placed his image beside hers in official art. She presented herself as the goddess Isis and Caesarion as Horus, the divine son destined to inherit the world. Soon after his birth, Cleopatra organized a grand journey along the Nile, a royal procession of hundreds of ships. Temples welcomed her as a living goddess. Priests blessed her son as a sacred ruler. This was not simply religious theater. It was a political message directly at both Egyptians and Romans. To Egyptians, it restored the ancient image of divine kingship. To Romans, it declared that Egypt was no longer ruled by a temporary ally. It was ruled by a dynastic family connected by blood to Caesar himself. Cleopatra understood something most Roman politicians refused to accept. Egypt did not need to defeat Rome militarily. It only needed to become indispensable. Grain from the Nile fed Roman cities. Gold from Egypt financed Roman armies. A child with Caesar's blood represented a future Rome could not easily ignore. Caesarion was not raised as a prince, he was raised as a claim, and through him, Cleopatra believed she had finally secured Egypt's position in the world. In 46 BC, Cleopatra traveled to Rome, not as a refugee, not as a defeated ruler, but as the reigning queen of Egypt and the mother of Caesar's son. She arrived with Caesarion and settled in a luxurious villa owned by Julius Caesar on the western bank of the Tiber. Rome had never seen a foreign ruler behave this way.
Ambassadors from client kingdoms usually arrived humbly. They requested favors. They avoided attention. Cleopatra did the opposite. She moved through the city openly. She received visitors as a monarch. She surrounded herself with Greek scholars, servants, and diplomats. Roman society reacted with confusion and anxiety. Senators whispered that Caesar intended to turn the republic into a monarchy. Roman women observed her with fascination and suspicion. Philosophers mocked her Eastern manners. The orator Cicero openly expressed his dislike. He described her as arrogant, manipulative, and dangerous. But Caesar ignored the criticism. He placed a golden statue of Cleopatra inside the temple of Venus, the ancestral goddess of the Roman people. This was more than an honor. It was a provocation, a foreign queen displayed in the heart of Roman religion. To many Romans, it confirmed their deepest fear, that Caesar was no longer simply a general. He was becoming a king, and Cleopatra was becoming part of Rome's future, not its periphery. For the first time, Egypt was not just supplying Rome with grain and gold. It was standing inside Rome itself. Cleopatra understood the risk. She knew that admiration could quickly turn into hostility, but she believed that visibility was power, that being present in Rome meant shaping its decisions from within. It was the boldest move of her life, and the most dangerous. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar entered the Senate. He did not leave alive. Surrounded by senators he trusted, he was stabbed repeatedly, not by enemies, by allies who claimed they were saving the Republic. Caesar's death shocked Rome, but its consequences reached far beyond the city. Cleopatra waited for news.
She waited for confirmation. She waited for Caesar's will. It never came. Caesarion was not named heir. Caesar's wealth was distributed to the Roman people, and a young relative named Octavian was adopted as his son. Cleopatra understood immediately what this meant. Her political future had vanished overnight. Without Caesar, she had no legal protection in Rome. Without recognition, her son had no claim to power. Cleopatra left the city quietly. No public farewell. No official explanation. She returned to Egypt not as a queen allied with Rome, but as a ruler preparing for another war. For the second time in her life, she had lost everything without a battle. After Caesar's assassination, Rome did not return to peace. It returned to violence. His killers were hunted. His supporters turned against one another. Out of the chaos emerged three men: Octavian, Mark Antony, Lepidus. Together they formed a new political structure known as the Second Triumvirate. It was not a republic. It was a military alliance, built to control the Roman world through force. The three divided the empire between them. Octavian took the western provinces. Antony took the eastern territories. Lepidus received Africa. Egypt now fell directly under Antony's influence. Antony needed resources. Armies required gold. Fleets required grain. Cleopatra understood the situation immediately. She did not openly support one faction. Instead, she financed several sides through intermediaries. Money moved through Cyprus, Syria, and private networks. Officially, Egypt remained neutral. In reality, it was becoming the financial center of another Roman civil war. Cleopatra was no longer waiting for Rome's decisions. She was preparing to shape them. Because in a world ruled by armies, neutrality was only temporary. And sooner or later, Antony would come to Egypt not as an ally, but as a man demanding loyalty. In 41 BC, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus. He did not invite her as an equal. He summoned her as a ruler suspected of disloyalty, a queen expected to explain her actions to a Roman general. Cleopatra did not arrive as a defendant. She arrived as a performance. Her ship sailed up the river like a floating palace. The sails were purple, the oars were silver. Incense filled the air before her voice did. Servants dressed as gods moved across the deck. Cleopatra appeared not as a petitioner, but as a ruler staging her own mythology. Antony was not offended. He was disarmed. The meeting reversed their roles. Antony became the guest.
Cleopatra became the center. Their alliance formed immediately, but it was not romantic in origin. Antony needed money, ships, and supplies for his eastern campaigns. Cleopatra needed a Roman protector after Caesar's death. Each offered the other exactly what Rome itself could not. Cleopatra provided gold, grain, and political legitimacy in the east. Antony provided armies and recognition inside the Roman system. Together, they created a new court in Alexandria. Not Roman, not Egyptian, but a hybrid monarchy built on ritual, ceremony, and spectacle. They hunted together. They held public feasts. They staged royal processions through the city. Their children were presented as dynastic heirs, not private individuals. To Rome, this looked like corruption. To Cleopatra, it was strategy. Antony was slowly abandoning the Roman model of power based on law and office.
He was adopting an Eastern model based on kingship and public display. Cleopatra was not escaping Rome. She was attempting to rebuild it in her own image. In 34 BC, Mark Antony staged a ceremony that shocked the Roman world. It took place not in Rome, not in a military camp, but in Alexandria. On a raised platform in the city's main square, Antony and Cleopatra appeared dressed as monarchs of the East. Cleopatra wore the robes of Isis. Antony was presented as Dionysus, the divine ruler of a renewed world. Before a massive crowd, Antony distributed kingdoms like personal gifts. Their son, Alexander Helios, was proclaimed King of Kings. He received Armenia and eastern territories that Rome still claimed as its own. Their daughter, Cleopatra Selene, was given Cyrenaica and lands in North Africa. Their youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was associated with Syria and the Levant. The ceremony became known as the Donations of Alexandria. To Egyptians, it looked like something familiar, a royal family publicly assigning the future of the world. To Romans, it looked like treason. Antony was not merely governing provinces, he was creating a new dynastic order, an Eastern monarchy with Cleopatra at its center. Even more disturbing was what Antony did next. He declared Caesarion the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, and implied that this child, not Octavian, was the true heir of Rome's greatest leader. This was no longer a private alliance. It was a direct challenge to Roman authority. Antony had crossed a line that could not be erased. He was no longer acting as a Roman official. He was acting as a king in a foreign capital. The donations were not legally binding in Roman law, but legality was no longer the issue. What mattered was visibility.
Titles spoken in public created political reality. Cleopatra had turned symbolism into strategy, and by doing so, she forced Rome to choose between two humiliations: accept an Eastern empire led by a foreign queen, or destroy it before it became permanent. Octavian never matched Antony in charisma. He never matched him in military reputation, but he understood something Antony never did. Power in Rome was no longer decided only by armies, it was decided by perception. Octavian did not attack Antony directly, he attacked his image. He presented Antony not as a political rival, but as a man who had abandoned Roman values, a general who no longer lived like a citizen, but like an Eastern king ruled by a foreign queen. Cleopatra became the perfect symbol in Octavian's speeches and pamphlets. She was no longer a ruler. She was a sorceress, a manipulator, a woman who used luxury and ritual to enslave Roman leaders. Octavian also used his own sister as a weapon. Octavia was Antony's legal wife. She represented Roman discipline, family, and loyalty. When Octavia attempted to join Antony in the east with supplies, Antony refused to meet her and sent her back to Rome. The humiliation was public. Octavian turned it into evidence, proof that Antony had chosen Egypt over Rome. Then Octavian crossed a sacred line. He obtained Antony's private will from the Temple of Vesta, a place no Roman politician was supposed to touch. He had it read publicly. The document suggested that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria.
that his loyalty no longer belonged to Italy, that Cleopatra and her children stood at the center of his future. For the Roman public, this was enough. The war was no longer about politics. It became a cultural struggle.
Rome against the East, discipline against decadence, law against ritual. Octavian did not declare war on Antony. He declared war on Cleopatra. And for the first time, Romans believed they were not fighting a civil war, but defending their world from a foreign empire. In 31 BC, the fleets of Rome and Egypt met off the western coast of Greece, near a place called Actium. Antony commanded a massive force, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers. Cleopatra provided much of the funding. Gold from Egypt paid for supplies, crews, and equipment. On paper, the Eastern Alliance appeared stronger. In reality, it was fragile. Antony's army was divided in loyalty. Many officers still considered Octavian the legitimate Roman leader. Octavian's general, Agrippa, controlled the seas. He cut supply lines. He isolated ports. He forced Antony into a long stalemate. Disease spread through the camps. Food became scarce. The battle itself was chaotic. Smoke covered the water. Ships collided. Fire spread across the waves. And then, in the middle of the fighting, Cleopatra's fleet broke formation. She sailed south toward Egypt. Antony hesitated, then followed her. The Eastern Command collapsed in a single moment. Actium was not a heroic defeat. It was a psychological one. The war was not lost because Antony lacked ships. It was lost because his alliance no longer believed in itself. From that moment on, victory was no longer possible, only delay. After Actium, Egypt waited for the inevitable. There were no more alliances to form, no armies to summon, no foreign powers willing to intervene. Octavian advanced slowly, not as a conqueror, as an administrator of history. Cleopatra attempted negotiations. She offered Egypt's wealth.
She offered her throne. She even offered to abdicate in favor of her children. Octavian refused every proposal. He wanted Egypt without conditions, and Cleopatra without power. As Roman forces entered Alexandria, rumors spread through the palace that Cleopatra had surrendered, that she had betrayed Antony. Antony believed them. He fell on his sword. But death did not come immediately. Mortally wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra's chamber. He died in her arms, not as a general, not as a ruler, but as a man who had outlived his world. Cleopatra understood what awaited her. Octavian intended to take her to Rome, to display her in chains during his triumph, to turn the last queen of Egypt into a symbol of Roman victory. She refused. The exact method remains unknown. A snake, a hidden poison, a needle coated in venom. History does not remember how she died, only that she chose when. Caesarion was captured soon after. A boy raised as a god, executed on Octavian's orders. Not for revenge, but for safety. There could be no rival. There could be no memory. Egypt became a Roman province, not conquered in a war, absorbed into an empire. Cleopatra did not die because she was weak. She died because her world had become obsolete. For 3,000 years, Egypt believed that power required legitimacy, that rulers were not owners of the state but guardians of order, that authority flowed from gods through ritual, through memory,
on tradition. Rome believed something else. That power was administrative, logistical, measurable. Rome did not need sacred kings. It needed provinces that produced grain, taxes, and soldiers. Cleopatra represented the last attempt to defend an ancient political model in a modern imperial world.
She did not lose because she chose the wrong men. She lost because she fought the wrong system. Egypt did not fall in a final battle. It was reorganized. Its temples became monuments. Its rituals became ceremonies. Its kings became administrators. The Nile still flooded. The cities still lived. But history no longer passed through Egypt. It passed through Rome. Cleopatra remains famous not because she was beautiful, but because she was the last ruler who tried to govern as if meaning still mattered. After her, the ancient world ended quietly, not with fire, but with